Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well, and I'm once again joined by Josiah, Osgood, and this week we're doing the third and the final part of the Roman Republic. And we ended last week with Sulla's brutal attack on Greece, and we started briefly talking about Caesar as well, and of course he will be one of the main protagonists of this episode. But before we go on, we haven't what we didn't much talk about was Sulla's rule as a dictator and how and maybe we should recap a little bit about how he became a dictator in the first place and the rise, so that's rise to power as well. Go a little bit back in time, but just a brief recap on the rise of Sulla.
Absolutely. So Sulla did have himself made dictator. And that, of course, nowadays is a terrible word. Nobody
Yeah,
wants to call themselves a dictator. Uh, at
they
the
call himself
time,
president instead.
yeah, president or uh, the People's Republic, whatever,
Yeah,
many
yeah.
different regimes can call themselves different names. But the dictator was an old position in the Roman Republic, and it was really just meant to be temporary, to be used in an emergency so that one person could take command and see Rome through a crisis. So Sulla got the dictatorship. What was different, though, was that he had it for as long as he wanted. Normally, you were
Mm.
limited to 6 months, very kind of Roman Republican idea. So Sulla got it for as long as he wanted. And he used it to do quite a lot of things. So he did want to settle scores with some of his enemies. He uh, killed some of them. He also, very importantly, set up a number of colonies in Italy. These were his veterans. And we've talked about how soldiers increasingly looked to their generals for rewards. So Sulla
Yeah.
took care of his men. And one of the most famous places he colonized actually is the city of Pompeii,
Ooh.
which destroyed later by Mount Vesuvius.
Spoiler.
You can go visit it. It's the most amazing
I
archaeological
was there in
site.
2018. It was really astounding to go there.
Yeah, isn't it incredible? You walk through it and
Oh
you
yeah.
feel you're in an ancient
And
city.
it's so big still. Like I'm sure I only saw like one quarter of the city when I was there, and I sure I didn't see all of it. But it's still so huge.
Very big, very sophisticated place. And what's interesting is Sulla sent soldiers there, and almost the very first thing they did, it seems, was they built a huge amphitheater where they could stage the fights of gladiators.
Mm.
And you can go visit that amphitheater. It's still standing now. But this sort of gives you a sense of the taste of the Roman soldiers of the time, that they wanted this
Mm.
as an entertainment space. There already was a theater in the town. They built the arena for the gladiators.
Mm.
So Sulla, the other thing we should say, so he took care of his enemies as well as his friends. That was kind of the rule he lived by. Actually, on his tomb, his epitaph said, "No one was better to his friends and nobody worse to his
Mm.
enemies."
Yeah,
But the
that
other
sums
thing
it
we
up
should,
pretty well.
yeah, I mean, it really is the perfect epitaph and explains a lot about Sulla and why he did what he did. But there is one
Mm.
other thing we should say. He put through a number of reforms politically, and he wanted basically to strip away some of the power that popular assemblies had. Because
If you don't mind,
remember,
before we go into that, if you don't mind, I just want to go back a little. You kind of already mentioned this, but I want to go a little bit because we talked about this kind of throughout the other two episodes as well. How, their council or dictator should only be for a certain amount of time, and that was kind of to shy away from the kings of Rome in the early days of the Rome's existence. So why would Sulla be allowed to, rule for as long as he liked? What was the exception there? Yeah, I said you kind of already talked about this, but what what was the difference here, and why? What was the word that he wouldn't be made king, like Caesar? They were worried that Caesar eventually would be doing as we will talk about a little bit later.
yes. So I think the simple answer is Sulla had so much military power, he could do whatever he wanted to. And remember, he invaded the city of Rome once back at the start of the war in 88
Yeah,
BC, and then again in 82 after his return to Italy. He invaded Rome a second time. He had his soldiers in the city. So basically, whatever he says goes. Now, his justification, right, was that Rome had been in a terrible crisis. Whether you liked Sulla or hated him, everyone would agree that the Republic was a mess at this
mm,
point. So he was saying, I need this power and for an indefinite period of time so I can get things working again. But nobody really had a choice. So they went along with it. Okay, at least the people in Rome. He has enemies elsewhere who are still fighting against him. For example, in Spain.
yeah.
But in Rome, they went along with it. What we should remember, though, is that it set a precedent. And of course, others would later do what Sulla did, but there was also a lot of fear. We don't want another Sulla.
Yeah.
And this is part of the story of why Julius Caesar aroused so much opposition. And Pompey, too, Sulla's young friend, people were afraid, oh, they're going to be powerful generals, just like Sulla.
So let's talk about some. You mentioned some of the reforms, and I just wanted to go into why he was allowed to be a dictator for so long. When the that we talked about the rules that the Republic had about consulship, and it's that being allowed for more than a year, etc., etc. But let's talk about some. Go back to the reforms that Sulla is known for.
Yes. So what's very important is there was this tension we've talked about between the Senate, right, which is supposed to be made up of the current and former magistrates, and traditionally had overseen a lot of the Republic. But then you also have the assemblies of the people. And Sulla wanted the Senate back in charge. So he did a couple of things. For example, he said no law can be passed by the assemblies unless the Senate approves it first. Okay, so obviously, in a way, that gives the Senate complete control. Magistrates would still be elected, okay, but they couldn't pass laws unless the Senate approved.
Mm.
He also said, for example, if you become tribune of the people, which was sort of the traditional popular champion, you cannot hold any other office. So, of course, that would deter anybody who was ambitious from wanting ever to be tribune. So he was really trying to cut back the powers of the people in their assemblies. This is the main thing to understand. And he pushed through all these reforms. He set up new courts, by the way, which would have as their jurors only senators. So the senators get a lot of power. And what's kind of interesting about Sulla is he does have the dictatorship, but actually he ended up resigning. He abdicated. He held a consulship, which was traditional, And then he just went off into retirement. He actually moved down to the Bay of Naples, the most luxurious part of the Roman
Mm.
world. And he didn't live too much longer, but he sort of enjoyed kind of a decadent existence in his last few
Mm.
years. You know, it's
But
sort of like moving to Miami
yeah,
Beach or something like that nowadays. And
we,
he was always very friendly with people in the theater. So he kind of enjoyed hanging out with this crowd. So he left. So from that point of view, he doesn't seem like an absolute tyrant.
no.
He was willing to give up power. So he was a reformer. He had serious ideas for how Rome should be governed to try to achieve stability after what had been a very turbulent period.
Mm. We talked about Sulla and Marius last week. How do you think it would be different had it been Marius and not Sulla who had gained power?
Yes, well, Marius was in charge for a while in between the periods when Sulla was in control. Uh, and it seems that Marius, right, was more friendly to the people, to the popular assemblies. Another thing about Marius was he really supported the new Italian citizens. Remember, Rome had fought this war against the
Mm. The
Italians,
social wars.
the social war. Yeah. And actually, they ended up giving citizenship to a huge number of Italians to settle the dispute. But people like Sulla wanted to water down their vote, right?
Mm.
Marius was actually friendlier to the Italians. So, um, but Marius was violent too, and actually he killed some of his own political enemies in a purge. So it wouldn't necessarily have been a lot nicer under Marius, but probably Marius wouldn't have made the Senate supreme, which was what Sulla was trying
Mm.
to do.
Now let's talk about we talked about some of the nicer things Sulla did, but also we gotta talk about somehow the enemies of Sulla would fare, and famously, of course, Caesar and the list of proscription that is famous for Sulla has. Is there a misconception about this list? And of course, most famously, biographers of Caesar will tell you that, Caesar was on the list and had to fear for his life, hide to his aunt or mother or whoever he had to survive. But also think it's important to remember that Caesar wasn't really very famous back then. And so how big in the eye of Sulla was a bit of a threat in the eye of Sulla was he at this point in time? And let's talk about the little list of prescription that he had against his enemies that dared cross him.
Yeah, so he would post up a list with names, and anybody on the list, if you brought in that man's head, you got a large cash reward. Furthermore, if you were a slave even, and you brought in one of those heads, you got your freedom. This was shocking to upper class Romans. Caesar was 18 at the time, so you're absolutely right. He's not a major political figure.
Does historians like to overplay this part of Caesar's life to dramatize in a way?
Well, this is the fascinating question, right? Now, he was the nephew of Marius, and he was already married to the daughter of kind of Marius's most important ally. So Caesar had this wife named Cornelia.
Yeah.
And we are told, actually, part of the story is that Sulla wanted Caesar to divorce this young woman. Now, that may seem kind of crazy, but of course, leading Roman politicians use marriage as a strategy, right? And Sulla might have been thinking, maybe I could win Caesar over, and I don't want him to stay part of the Marian side. What I think certainly happened is Caesar refused. He said, I'm not giving up my marriage to this young woman. And he stayed with her until she died. She didn't live that long, but Caesar stayed with her. Caesar's only
Is that where we
child
get Julia from?
was Julia, exactly, until, probably he had a son with Cleopatra
Yeah.
much later. Yeah. So this marriage definitely was important to Caesar. So what happened? We're told that he feared for his life and went into hiding. No ancient source says he was actually proscribed, but that he was afraid he might be killed. And we are told he even gave some soldiers money to save his life. We're also told he was very sick at the time. He might have had malaria. So it's very hard to untangle, exactly what happened because it could have been useful to Caesar later in life to exaggerate the danger because he did not like Sulla and his whole political career was sort of about uh, fighting against what Sulla had done. So I think he probably was in some danger and certainly felt he was,
Mm,
but maybe he actually wasn't officially proscribed. But they
mm,
made up. They made up. Caesar's mother was well connected. His father was dead by this point, but his mother was very well connected. And we're told that she sort of arranged things so that it would be okay for him. He actually ended up going off to do military service soon after this happened. So he went
mm.
to the east. He got out of Rome.
Now we have to mention someone I know you've been itching to talk about as well, and that is of course Cicero or Cicero, if you don't want to be politically correct. And of course, we gotta talk about his famous line that he says to Sulla in under the famous painting, of course, in the Roman Republic course. So let's talk about the rise of Cicero and his involvement in the regime of Sulla.
Yes, so Cicero is a little bit older than Caesar. Different background, though. He came from a small town in Italy, south of Rome. Nobody in his family had been involved in Roman politics. So he is, like Marius, a new man. He would have to make a name for himself if he wanted to rise up in politics. He was very clever and proved to be a very good public speaker and especially a very good trial lawyer. So, what he realized is that he could rise up in society through arguing in the courts. Now, the problem is during the Civil War, the courts had been shut down. Sulla reestablished them as part of his reforms. And Cicero, this was Cicero's moment. He took on a really big case. It was actually the first murder trial after the end of Sulla's prescriptions. So everybody in Rome is sort of wondering, can we actually bring to trial murderers again? During Sulla's time, you got rewarded for assassinating somebody.
Yeah.
So it was a case where there would be a lot of attention. And Cicero actually ended up defending a man. He was about 40 years old, but he was accused of murdering his own father. And to Romans, that was the most heinous crime imaginable to kill your father. So that also made this trial of great interest. And Cicero took on the defense and he won the case. He got his client acquitted. And what made it very juicy was Cicero actually claimed that his client was trying to be framed by a powerful freedman, an ex-slave of Sulla. And this guy had made a lot of money in the Civil War. Cicero went after him. And probably the senators, people of the upper classes, they were sort of glad to see Cicero taking on this guy who seemed too powerful. So it was a very, very clever move for Cicero. He got a lot of publicity through this trial, And that's really when he entered public life. He started getting a lot of cases afterwards. He went off, interestingly, for a while to the east. We're told he was very skinny when he was young. He came under physical strain, so he had to go off to the east and sort of study with the master orators in Greece. He also started to work out in the gym, put on some weight. Sulla died. Cicero came back to Rome and resumed his legal career and started to rise politically as well.
We
So
will come back to
his
the
early
other
years
part
are
of the
very
day.
heroic.
Mm. We will come back to the other time when he was in Cataline and then later, of course. And there are a few other players we have to talk about as well. And I think to shorten it a little bit because we got a lot of topics to go through this episode. And that is, of course, Pompey and Marius Crassus, and the famous rivalry they had. So let's talk a little bit about the rise of both of these characters. And of course, because they are not essential to the story that we will talk a little bit about the Spartacus War in a moment, but want to talk a little bit about the rise of Pompey and Crassus as well.
Yeah. So a very interesting thing in Roman history kind of is where were you
Yeah,
in the Civil War,
not
right?
born
It's going to
yet.
haunt the next generation. Cicero's, we said, was mostly out of things, so that proved uh, good for him. Caesar maybe was a victim. Pompey and Crassus were a little bit older than Caesar. So, like many others, right, they ended up fighting on behalf of Sulla and doing some things that could be considered very dirty, fighting against fellow Roman citizens. Pompey had a particularly um, good war as far as he was concerned. He actually raised kind of his own army. This is the sort of thing that's going on now. He raised his own army, and when Sulla came back to Italy from Greece, Pompey appeared and said, I'm here to help you. And Pompey kind of became Sulla's lieutenant. And he went to Sicily, he went to Africa, he went to various places to stamp out the resistance to Sulla. Crassus fought too for Sulla militarily. The other thing he's notorious for is he grew very rich
Mm.
during this time of prescriptions and acquired a lot of property. He owned apartment buildings in Rome, which is a very lucrative thing because you can charge high rent in the city. So both of them do very well in this period under Sulla. But of course, later when people talk more freely, questions get asked about whether they really had kind of any morality or were just taking advantage of this situation
Mm.
to get rich and to get powerful.
We have to talk about the famous fire brigade that Sulla had to take over apartments and raise trust as well for the citizens. That's perhaps one of the things he's most famous for.
Yeah, Crassus would show up when a building was burning, and he had his own slaves that he trained as firemen, right? And he would start negotiating
Yeah.
on the price as the building was burning. And, the more it burned, actually, the lower the price went. And he would buy it up. But then he also used specially trained slaves to rebuild. So he could make a lot of money by building larger apartment houses. So he was he had a reputation for being very shady, doing things that were
Mm.
um, designed just to get him money. And this is really to look forward a little bit how he would ultimately meet his demise.
Yeah.
He wanted to go off to the east to fight the great Parthian
Mm.
Empire. He thought, I'm going to get rich
Is that
even
scene what
beyond
I
my dreams. And it, of course, did not work out for him.
We will talk about this a little later, of course, but is that what inspired the famous Game of Thrones scenes in season one when I think his Tar I don't remember his name, but Khaleesi's brother died with a gold, melted gold. Did that scene inspire Crassus' death? Really feels familiar.
That could be right. I've never read Game of Thrones, but that is the story about Crassus, is that when the Parthians, this is sort of the new Persian Empire,
I
when
think it's
they
Viserys' name.
when they defeated him, uh, to punish him, one of the stories is they poured
Yeah.
gold, molten gold down his throat. And the other thing, the other story that's told that's even more horrible is that the Parthians actually liked Greek uh, theater. You know, there's a lot of Greek cities, even in the Parthian Empire,
Mm.
established by Alexander the Great and his successors. So they were actually staging to entertain the king a play by Euripides called The Bacchae. And there's a terrible moment at the end of the play, really horrific. The mother realizes in a fit of madness she'd killed her own son.
Mm.
And the story is that when the head of the son was needed as a prop for the play, they used Crassus's head to
Mhm.
entertain the king.
Oh,
So yeah, this is definitely rich material for later story writers to draw
yeah.
on.
But where does the rivalry between Crassus and Pompey begin? Because we already is it the Spartacus War that we will talk about later that crosses this, and what was their relationship like at the beginning versus how versus after the Spartacus War, and we'll get into that in a moment. But just what were their relationship like before the famous rivalry that they had?
They mostly never got along, but I mean, Pompey was definitely in a class of his own. The amazing thing is he held no office politically until he became consul. Sulla awarded him with triumphs. Pompey got to be called Magnus, meaning the Great,
Yeah.
as if he's the new Alexander. So he was in a class separate from Crassus. I think this would have made Crassus very envious. I don't remember too much about whether they are known to have fought a lot until we get to the time of the War of Spartacus.
Mm.
Um, when they, for a while will cooperate, we'll talk about that. Then they start to quarrel again. Then a little bit later on, Julius Caesar brings them back together
Mm.
in an alliance along with Caesar. So they're willing to work with each other sometimes, but I think Crassus probably in particular resented Pompey.
So let's talk about the Spartacus War, and of course, one of the most famous slave revolt, and it's also kind of ironic that or not poetic, I suppose. It's a better word when the slavery in America would, where they would call their slaves by Roman names, and there would also be a Spartacus War in slave revolt in America many centuries later. So it's kind of in a way, history does rhyme, but let's talk about the ancient Spartacus War for now, and let's talk about the cause of how the slave revolt actually happened.
Yes. So Sulla died, and Italy, there are scars of this war. It's a traumatic event, and there's still kind of a lot of unrest. And this is some of the background. But the story is incredible. And, especially nowadays, I think modern audiences, fans of Roman history, they really connect with Spartacus. He just seems like a heroic figure. So he was a gladiator. And we talked about Pompeii, the big new amphitheater. Gladiators were starting to become very hot. Politicians want to stage shows with gladiators. So a market is developing. Now, gladiators typically were enslaved men, so they might be captives in war or otherwise enslaved and sold. So there are these schools down in the area of Naples, actually near Pompeii, where they train these young men to fight. Now, obviously, there's a security problem here, right? If you have the most skilled fighters in the whole
Mm.
Roman world in large numbers training, potentially they could activate as a military force.
And we have to remember that
So,
gladiators weren't these, they were almost slaves at this point in time. They weren't these celebrities that we think of. And I mean, even though it's not great as Gladiator might be, it's kind of a fair represent the movie by Ridley Scott. It's kind of a fair we see this a little bit of how they actually were more not slaves, rather, though while they were sporting heroes, they were also slaves in a way that, they weren't, but they were also famous. They were also more like slaves than if anything.
yes, they were enslaved. You know, they didn't have a choice about this. But to
I mean,
be
some had a choice,
blunt,
but there were very few that went down about it.
yeah, probably over time, some more people entered it because you could win a lot of fame. But to be blunt, I mean, the Romans are clever about this, and they realize to get people to fight and to fight well, we need to create incentives. So they would do things like free gladiators, give them large cash prizes, etc. So there was some hope that they could really improve their lives if they did well. And over time, it seems that probably, the number of men actually killed in these fights wasn't vast because they're
Mm.
such an expensive resource. You have the best physical specimens of men, and then you spent years training them. It's not that
A
easy
bit of a
just to,
waste.
yeah, yeah. So it's kind of becomes a whole industry. It's very interesting to study and kind of think about how it worked. But people did not like being forced into this, and that's what the Spartacus War proves. So he was in one of these training schools in southern Italy. He had, we are told, actually been in the Roman army, not as a citizen. He was from a place called Thrace, which is basically modern Bulgaria, sort of on the border of the Roman Empire, a place that always had a reputation for producing kind of fierce warriors. So the Romans used these guys sometimes in wars, but somehow Spartacus ended up enslaved and was sold, we are told, in the city of Rome, right, into slavery, and then was sent to this school. And what happened was he and I think about 70 other men in the school, in the training facility, they staged a breakout. And actually were told, this is a wonderful detail, they armed themselves with the knives from the kitchen.
Mm.
Clearly you don't leave the swords lying around, for the
Yeah,
gladiators to take just whenever they want. So this took some planning, right? We don't get lots of details, but this was a breakout, right? This took some thought. And then they, have to escape. Okay. And we're told that on the road, they actually run into, I think it's a group of soldiers, and they kill them and take their weapons. So they have real weapons at this point. And they end up going to Mount Vesuvius, right, which is near Pompeii on the Bay of
mm.
Naples.
Also an
And
amazing
there's,
visit if you're in nearby. You should absolutely go to
yeah,
the
you can
volcano. It's
climb up
really
to the
amazing.
top. You can climb up to the top, and
Mm.
sometimes there's smoke coming
Hopefully it
up.
won't erupt, but you never know.
It's very dramatic. Yeah. Wonderful thing to do. I agree. So,
Absolutely.
so Spartacus and his guys, right, are kind of seeking refuge there. And the Romans send some small forces against them that first year of the revolt, and Spartacus defeats them. And the story of Mount Vesuvius is another one of these exciting moments because it seems like Spartacus might be trapped, but actually his men weave ladders using the vines. So they managed to climb down on a part of the mountain where the Romans didn't expect them. And Spartacus goes on to do some great things. He, for example, one of the Roman commanders against him, Spartacus captures the guy's horse. So this is, the ultimate humiliation that a slave, a gladiator, is beating Roman armies.
Mm.
And the Romans send ever larger numbers of men, armies, whole armies, to try to defeat Spartacus. Meanwhile, because of his successes, he's attracting a lot of followers. So we're told initially he has a lot of Thracians, also Gauls. And that was another ethnic group that was used in the gladiatorial schools. But he gets other people to join him, including, we're told, a lot of the shepherds. These are tough dudes. They're guys who, have to drive the cattle through the hills and mountains of Italy and protect against wild animals, protect against bandits. So these are ferocious fighters themselves. So
Yeah.
he builds up maybe an army of 100,000,
Mm.
which is
Does he have
incredible.
does he have an end game, or is it kind of just like Hannibal to cause as much damage to Rome as you possibly can, or is it escaping, the clutches of Rome and into perhaps Parthia or another civilization? Does he really have an end game here, or do we know if, it's just cause as much havoc as he can?
Yes, so he makes it to northern Italy with his army, and they defeat the consuls as well as the governor of northern Italy. So this is sort of his moment of supreme power. It seems like maybe he wanted his men and his allies to flee back to their homelands at this point. But the army, we are told, at least a large number of them, they don't want to leave. They are enjoying this lifestyle of plundering Italy, right?
Yeah.
Gaining wealth, having revenge on the Romans for all these terrible things they've done. So they turn back south, and Spartacus goes along with them. He continues to fight. One of his ideas seems to be to try to get Sicily to erupt into a slave revolt. There had been a couple of major slave wars in Sicily earlier. This kind of was his inspiration. So he's hoping to get allies there to make this an even bigger problem for the Romans. That never worked out. And we're also told he was trying to work with pirates, who were a big problem at this period, to get ships, so he could get to Sicily and maybe elsewhere. So he's trying to spread this war. There's no doubt about it, but doesn't end up succeeding. And he
Mm.
ultimately gets trapped uh, or sort of forced into fighting a battle by Crassus, who
Yeah.
became the supreme commander. This is in the year 71, so a couple years after the war started.
Mm. Let's talk about the death of Spartacus and of course how Pompey's involvement in this as well, because Pompey famously takes credit for, Spartacus' defeat, and he manages to come first to Rome and take advantage, and that obviously put a further rift in the relationship with Crassus, and he's almost humiliated in a way. So let's talk about how do we know this, that, it was actually Crassus that won the Spartacus war when Pompey clearly has the propaganda on his side.
Yes, well, I think Crassus did win the war, really, uh,
Mm.
because he tried to build a wall to sort of hem Spartacus and his army in, kind of in the, if you think of Italy as a boot, right in the toe of Italy, Spartacus manages to break through this fortification, but soon afterwards he is forced into a major battle by Crassus, and he loses the battle. Apparently, he falls in the battle, but we don't really know exactly how he died. He wasn't given a burial or anything like that that we know of. Probably not surprising that we never know for sure.
Mm,
But there are still men of his running around Italy, because he has unleashed total chaos. So Pompey was coming back from Spain, and he'd been fighting kind of opponents of Sulla there. He finally was victorious. We've discussed the
mm.
difficulties of wars in Spain.
Yeah.
It was another one who learned the lesson the hard way. It took him a while, but he finally makes it back to Italy, and he wants credit not just for his war in Spain, but for destroying Spartacus or the remnants of the Spartacus War. So he does
Mm,
round up some of Spartacus's allies. But I think the credit really should go to Crassus. Now, there's
mm,
a famous story, very chilling, that uh, Crassus had some of the survivors, we're told 6,000 actually, of Spartacus crucified.
mm,
And this was the most brutal form of execution. You would hang up there on the cross and very slowly asphyxiate. So it was an agonizing death, and it was meant to be. And we're told that he placed these crucifixes, the crosses, I should say, all along the major highway that went from southern Italy to Rome. So, of course, many, many travelers, including slaves, would see this torment. And that was very brutal, but very typical of Rome, right? To use spectacular punishments to try to deter others from rebelling. The Romans have a sort of grotesque genius for these spectacular punishments. And of course, if you know the New Testament later, right? I mean, this is kind of what is going on there, right? With the crucifixion.
mm,
So this is a terrible warning, really, to slaves. Don't think about doing this again.
mm.
And there's never really another war on
Yeah.
the scale of Spartacus. There are periodic problems, especially during civil wars for the Roman government, but they never faced something like this again. So, Crassus, it shows his ruthlessness, right? The way he ended up winning this war. And then, yeah, Pompey was trying to get credit. What happens is they both end up holding at the same time the consulship the year afterwards. And Pompey gets a big triumph because he's fought in Spain. Crassus doesn't really get the full parade because he's only fought slaves, which isn't glorious. So he's kind of mad about that, of course.
Mm. Now let's talk about Caesar in all this as well, and we have because we haven't seen him in a while. So that's is, of course, we know that Caesar eventually marries his daughter Julia into Pompey's family, and she eventually dies, of course, so this further strains their relationship. But let's talk about Caesar in this all of this as well.
Yeah, Caesar, it seems, has a military position during the war against Spartacus, but we're never told anything more. So probably he didn't do anything particularly notable, or we would have heard
Mm,
about it. The thing about Caesar in this period is he's clearly, we can tell in hindsight, very talented, very charming. He starts to develop this bond with the Roman people. He's a very handsome young man. He kind of dresses um, in a provocative way, sort of like the way almost like a rock star or something would. He attracts attention to himself, but he's politically not a major power, and nor for that matter is he militarily. a major power yet, a major player. So he's kind of working his way up. He does have one story, I'll just mention it
Yep.
quickly. In the middle of the 70s, he goes off to study rhetoric, public speaking in the East, the way Cicero had. And the story is told that he was kidnapped by pirates, and there definitely was an increase in piracy at the time. And they hold him captive because they want a ransom. They knew he was valuable, so they, say, if you give us money, we will free you. So Caesar sends to his friends and so on, and they provide the ransom. But we're told he threatens the pirates. You better watch out. You may think I'm nobody, but I'm going to come back after you. And that's exactly what he ends up
Yeah.
doing. And he raises a few ships and captures the pirates. And then, once again, what does he do afterwards? He crucifies them.
Mm. I was talking with Adrian Goldsworth, I think it's almost 3 years ago now, which is incredible to think that it's so long ago. I mean, it's just the credibility of this story because most of it really comes from the eye of Caesar, who of course is victorious in this. So how credible do you find the story of the pirates to be? Is it mostly propaganda because Caesar was a master, and we will come back to this of course as well. Caesar was a master of propaganda. So how much is of this do you think is just fiction, pure fiction, and how do you think there's a reality to this?
I think it happened personally. Um, there was kind of a lot going on in the Roman East in this period. There was going to be another war with Mithridates. I think Caesar, part of why he was there was not just for public speaking, but was maybe to see some military action. I think it's quite possible, he did have this run-in with the pirates and then realized he could turn it into kind of a great story about himself to win credit and fame back in Rome. So I'm not saying he made it up or it didn't happen, but I think pretty early on, he kind of realized this is an opportunity I can exploit.
Hmm.
And then, yeah, probably the later biographies reflect his propaganda and kind of knowledge of who Caesar later became. So it's good to be cautious about these stories. But to my mind, the idea that it's totally made up is unconvincing.
There's also the story of Caesar as well, going to the east and having a sexual relationship with one of the leaders there. And that they kind of was made fun of. I don't remember exactly. I think that how it was the bottom in the relationship with the male, with one of the rulers there. So what are your thoughts on that story?
Yeah, so this one's interesting because there Caesar looks less heroic, right? I
Hmm.
mean, this was kind of the worst thing for a
I mean,
Roman
not that
man
there's
to be.
anything wrong with that kind of relationship, of course, but but in those times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I mean. It was like the worst thing to be accused of. So, so here, um, I think Caesar definitely had a friendship with this king, and he supported the king's family later after the king died. So I think this, though, was kind of a smear that was invented by his enemies once he started to argue in the courts and become more powerful. This was a way to discredit him. It's it's one of the most standard insults actually kind of in Rome
Yeah,
to use this. And it reflects the fact that he was a good-looking guy and he dressed kind of sharply.
yeah.
So there was some credibility. But in this case, I don't really believe the full story. Um, whereas, the pirate thing, like that's not a typically made up thing. It's more unique. So I'm more inclined to believe it.
It's
But
kind of
maybe you can
like,
just say I'm a Caesarian. I
yeah,
only believe the good things about him.
yeah. It's kind of like how the rumors that Catherine the Great had sexual relationship with a horse kind of story. It's nonsense, but it's a fun story nonetheless.
Rome is a place that is addicted to rumors and gossip. I
Mm,
think you raise a good point. And if you just understand that, you sort of learn a lot about Roman society and see a lot, that they love to spread stories, to discredit each other, to make themselves look good. It's hard then when we read our sources, because sometimes maybe they're just repeating the stories.
yeah,
But we can certainly see that, yeah, the Roman people love to spread tales, especially about their politicians. The politicians are kind of like celebrities
mm.
nowadays.
I mean,
You
imagine if
know,
social media was a thing back then.
completely. It's exactly the same culture, and like nicknames and
Mm,
insults and, do you like each other? All this kind of stuff.
yeah,
And and the Romans, right, of course, have no mass media, no radio, nothing.
mm.
So everything has to spread by word of mouth. And
And you know the story, the chicken that lost one feather and eventually lost 100 kind of thing.
totally, totally, yeah. And so, it's like one of this happens in ancient Mediterranean cities that where you have a lot of people, they like to talk about whoever is in charge and sometimes tell outrageous stories. So Alexandria,
Yeah,
Egypt, they gave all of their kings very unflattering nicknames. Like they called one of them
ton of pot belly, for example.
Pot Belly. Yeah. So the Alexandrians do this earlier, the Athenians, they make fun of the politicians. So these Mediterranean cities, they must, they would be scary places for us. The disease would be awful. The hygiene was not great always, but they must have been fun too. People
Yeah.
really have developed the art of storytelling in
Mm.
these places.
Now, there's another player that we have to, and I said there's a lot of players that we have to discuss in this episode. And one of them is, of course, Cataline, that will rival Cicero. And we have to talk a little bit about the rise of Cataline as well, and the attempted coup d'etat that would lead to the attempted coup d'etat. So let's talk about how Cataline would come to the scene.
Yeah, so we're now entering the 60s BC, and Cataline was another one of these former officers of Sulla who had fought for Sulla in the Civil War and allegedly killed some men, also made some money. He was a patrician, so kind of like Caesar, kind of like Sulla. The family hadn't been very successful recently. He's trying to bring back their glory. So he's moving along in his political career. He's accused of all sorts of terrible things, sleeping with Vestal virgins, for example. Okay.
It's just a
He
big
was put,
no-no.
yes. Um, I mean, this is a charge that kind of goes around. I think Crassus was accused of it at one point too, and said, "Oh no, I was just talking with her about business deals." Of course, everybody believed it because with Crassus, that's what he liked to talk about. So Catiline went off as a governor of Africa. Apparently, he treated the people there terribly. He was put on trial. Once again, he was acquitted, but he really, had a reputation that was unsavory. So why this becomes a major episode in Roman history is because
Mm.
he ended up running against Cicero for the consulship. And remember, Cicero's a new man.
Yeah.
New men aren't supposed to rise this easily in politics, but he had done so. And he part of how he campaigns for office is remember Cicero has that wonderful tongue. So he spreads terrible stories about Cataline
Mm.
and
Not
gave
the
a
best of
very,
friends.
oh no, and he gave a vicious speech. We have quotations from it, not the whole speech, but just the quotations are vicious against Cataline in the Senate. So they become enemies. And when Cicero won, along with a guy named Antonius, Cataline lost. he was so humiliated. It's bad enough that he lost, but he is lost to a new man
Mm.
when he was the patrician. So those two really have a feud with one another at this point.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, didn't he draw into a tremendous amount of debt as well for this campaign as well?
Cataline uh, seemed to live large. He liked to spend on parties and things. He also, we are told, bribed a lot to try to win his way into office. And there was definitely a lot of bribery going on in this period. The lots of laws against it, they never seemed to work. So Cataline uh, has enough resources that he tries to run again for the consulship a second time. And this was in the year now when Cicero himself was holding the consulship. And Cataline more and more seems to be interested in cultivating different sorts of power bases, especially appealing to the downtrodden in society.
Yeah.
Uh, Veterans of Sulla who are struggling on their farms, displaced peasants, the poor in Rome, struggling to pay the rent on those tenement apartments where they lived. And Cicero, more and more, is the champion of the wealthy. He kind of was put into power by these bankers and by sort of nobles too. Uh, they wanted their property protected. That was Cicero's job. So he and Cataline kind of get locked into a political struggle. When Cataline is running for the second time of the consulship, he starts to talk about canceling debts, or at least forgiving some debts. And, we can identify with this sort of politics today. It's what we would call populism, right? And obviously, it is answering a real need of struggling Romans. Cicero wants nothing to do with it, so he continues to smear Cataline, and Cataline ends up losing a second time. And at that point, he really feels humiliated, but he also has been cultivating these veterans. So he sets into motion a planned coup d'etat. He is going to try to topple Cicero, topple the government in Rome, and put himself into the consulship. Now, you may say, I mean, this seems outrageous,
Mm.
right? A politician doing this sort of thing. But remember, this is kind of what Sulla did.
Yeah,
If you don't like what you get, you march with an army. That's what Cataline was
100%.
trying to do. So uh, it's a sort of an interesting story because, Cataline definitely, in my view, was sort of very cynical. I mean, he hadn't been a popular champion his whole career. He just came into this because it was his last, most desperate hope. Cicero shows a lot of courage, I think, in battling Cataline, trying to denounce him when others didn't want to hear about it, trying to secure Rome. Where I think we can fault Cicero, though, is he really had no sympathy for the people who were supporting Cataline. He just said, this is the dregs of society. And I think he then was out of touch himself in some ways. But it ends up in this huge showdown in Rome. Cataline fled to the army in northern Italy. So Rome has to send out an army. So this was a real military threat. But Cataline also had left a few people in Rome who apparently were supposed to destabilize the city, light fires, cause chaos, kill people, to prepare the way for Cataline to come back. Cicero manages to,
Seems like such a nice welcome.
yeah, yeah, and Cicero is, I mean, this is where he's at his most brilliant. He knows who these people are because he actually has spies. And one of his chief spies is actually the mistress of one of the Catalanarians. And she's slipping Cicero all the information about what's going on. The problem is he can't really go to the Senate and reveal it because otherwise he would lose his source. This is like
Yeah.
intelligence. Um, so anyway, he ends up discovering that some of the people of Gaul are in Rome. They're struggling with debts just like everyone else. Um, the conspirators of Cataline try to recruit them, and they go to Cicero, and he gets them to get letters from the conspirators to take back to Gaul. And then Cicero uh, has some soldiers capture the letters when the guys are going back to Gaul. And then he takes this into the Senate and opens the letters and reveals everything. And at this point, then the associates of Cataline in Rome are arrested. What is problematic is Cicero, with the support of the Senate, then executes them. It's 5 people. He executes them without a trial. And that, again, was very controversial. You're supposed to be given a trial
Yeah.
before you're put to death. So this proves to be a huge mistake for Cicero to have done that.
Mm. Let's talk about the famous speech and, of course, the famous painting that, with Cataline and Cicero, where he says, how far will you continue to abuse our patient, Cataline? For how much longer will that rage of yours make a mockery of us? And what's interesting with this speech, perhaps, is that it's also still used to this days in protest all around the world. And it's such an iconic speech by Cicero, one of his most famous ones, that arguably he is mostly remembered for. But we have to, so that also it's inevitable that we have to discuss this famous line as well, and of course the famous painting where he supposedly goes against Cataline in the Senate, and of course say the famous lines.
Yeah, it's a wonderful speech, very passionate. It's often used to teach students Latin. I read it in high school, and my teacher uh, captured our interest because she said that she would wake up in the middle of the night having nightmares about Cataline. Maybe she said that just to get us excited.
Interesting way to get inspired.
Yeah, yeah, but um, so Cicero, it must have been a very dramatic occasion because what happened was Cicero was in the Senate. He's the consul, so he presides over the Senate. So they're meeting about things. And then Cataline kind of unexpectedly walked in. And Cicero tells us, right, that Cataline moved to sit down, and everyone on the benches near him got up and left. So he was sitting there all alone.
Mm.
And then Cicero just attacks him pretty ruthlessly. And part of the story is actually there had been an attempt to assassinate Cicero the night before. And Cicero, because of his spies, knew about it and prevented it. But in the speech, he makes clear to Cataline, I know what you were planning. So the painting, very famous painting, you see it all over the internet everywhere. I think it's in the Senate House of in Rome, right? So it's the Senate of the Italian Republic, painted in the 19th century. And it shows Cicero standing there in the Senate. Then it shows Cataline brooding, sitting all by himself on the benches. And then there are other senators, and it's really worth going to look at. Some of the senators look
Yeah, I
shocked.
still picture it in my head right now as we're talking about it.
Yeah, but it's funny, a couple of them look like they're sort of falling asleep too. Like, oh, we've heard Cicero go on so much before. So it's kind of an amusing painting. I mean, it's very graphic, but
Little did
there's
they
sort
know
of
he would
some
deliver
jokes
an
in it.
iconic speech.
Yeah. But it's definitely a powerful speech. And I do think, as I said, while Cicero made some mistakes, I think it did take a lot of courage for him to give a speech like that. And it's kind of this common theme in Rome that if you feel you're fighting a tyrant, it's glorious and you're entitled to do whatever you want to do to save the Republic. So, of
Yeah.
course, later Brutus and Cassius will assassinate Julius Caesar. Cicero kind of feels like he's one of these great Republican heroes.
Mm. Now we have to go back to Caesar a little bit because, of course, we don't have too much time. We only have like a little less than an hour, and I'm not sure we'd have entirely time to cover everything at once. So I'm sorry if I'm going a little bit ahead, but we have to talk a little bit about Caesar and his Crassus governorship to Gaul, and how did he end up getting Gaul in the first place? And I know I'm briefly summarizing a little bit here, but like I said, we made a few years ago an episode with Adrian Goldsworthy where we discussed Caesar in further detail. But so if you want to know more, you can go back and listen to that episode. But no, the brief story summary is that he had the consulship and then he gets a governorship in Gaul, and from what I remember, that was mostly just to get him away from Rome. That that he got the governorship in Rome, in Gaul, was just mainly to get him out of the main scene, because Rome was, sorry, Gaul was kind of like the furthest outpost you could possibly get at the time.
Yes. Yeah, and Adrian's book about Julius Caesar is a wonderful account with both about Caesar's politics, but also very good on Caesar as a
Absolutely.
general. Yeah, I recommend it. So Caesar, in the period after Cataline, actually, he sort of won some fame because he gave a speech in the Senate warning Cicero not to execute the conspirators. Obviously, Cicero didn't listen to Caesar. Caesar was kind of proven right. And remember, Caesar was the popular champion. So he's attached to the idea that every Roman citizen should have a trial, right, before
Yeah.
being killed. So Caesar's rising politically, and he ends up holding the consulship. And Pompey had come back from the east. He'd finally defeated Mithridates, the great enemy of Rome. And Pompey brought back his soldiers, and he was trying to get them land, this theme we're always dealing with. And the Senate didn't want to go along with him. So Caesar, running for office, decides to make a deal where he, Crassus, and Pompey will join forces, and they'll each get the things that they want. So Pompey's veterans get land thanks to Julius Caesar. Crassus gets various things he wants. Caesar, though, had to use a bit of force to get his legislation through. So he was left vulnerable politically. Was afraid, after office, what could happen to me? Maybe they'll put me on trial.
Mm.
So exactly as you say, he gets this kind of super command to go to Gaul. And Pompey had had commands like this before. It's kind of, the new thing in Rome. Everybody wants one of these extended commands because you can really build up a loyal army and you can make a lot of money and you can win incredible glory. Of course, it's very much not in the tradition of the Republic
Mm.
to have power for so long. But Caesar gets one of these super commands, and it's northern Italy, which is important because it's close to Rome, but it's also Gaul beyond the Alps. And it's actually also Illyricum, which is across the Adriatic. So it's a huge territory. And I think the idea is it would provide him lots of recruiting grounds for soldiers, uh, and lots of military
So
opportunities.
it wasn't to get him out of Rome, to kind of, get him away from the main politics in the city.
Well, I think he wanted the immunity, right? Because this is
Yeah.
the key point is when you have a military command, you're basically untouchable by the Roman government. because they always felt, a commander needed in his theater supreme power, and you can't go recalling your generals all the time to put them on trial or whatever. That's what the
Yeah,
Athenians did, and the Romans never cared for that idea. So, and of course, the Romans built a huge empire. The Athenians didn't. So you can see the Roman thinking. But this was starting to be a problem because people like Caesar, wanted commands so they could never be touched by the government. And that means there's no civilian control anymore over armies. So he goes off to his province. And what happens is actually there's the people in modern Switzerland, the so-called Helvetians, they start to migrate. They are being driven out of their homeland. There's pressure on them by Germans to the north, the east. So the Helvetians want to migrate, and this, Caesar claims, is threatening Roman control in Gaul. So he races up there with his army and tries to prevent the Helvetians from carrying out this migration. And they end up getting into a war. And this was Caesar's first major battle in Gaul was against the Helvetians. And it's actually one of Caesar's nearest defeats. He'd never fought a battle on this scale before. And you can read Caesar's own account of this war,
yeah.
famous
Which again,
commentaries.
which I highly recommend.
The account of this battle is very interesting because what he says there actually is that it's really the discipline of
Mm.
his soldiers that saved the day.
I
And
know I've done a
Caesar,
lot of I know I've done a lot of comparison, but I'm not different you for doing another one. But it's what's interesting when Napoleon goes into Italy and Egypt as well. He uses the same propaganda method that Caesar does when he writes about, especially in Egypt, which was a disaster. He uses propaganda, write his own, almost in the way that Caesar did, to get the people on his side and to kind of get the idea of that he was far better than what he really was. So Napoleon as well uses the same genius method that Caesar did with the Gallic Wars, and especially and the accounts that he write back to Rome. So it's really, I think it's a fascinating comparison there.
yes, yeah, Napoleon wanted to surpass Caesar. He also wanted to surpass Augustus. He was
Mm.
going to create a lasting empire. Of course, it failed. And remember, when he was in exile, he spent his time writing about Caesar's Gallic Wars and trying to point out all the things Caesar did wrong that he, Napoleon, would have done better. So, yeah, the hubris is
Mm.
incredible. But of course, ambition, right? If you don't have ambition in life, you're never going to get anywhere. So it kind of makes sense that these great figures, right, have this audacity. So Caesar has it. So he goes off to Gaul and has this victory. But as I said, what's interesting is especially when describing the first major battle, he really emphasizes that it was the discipline of his army that helped save the day, that helped give him his victory.
Mm.
And this is kind of one of the interesting things about Caesar's book is that he really highlights the ordinary soldiers. He's not terribly nice about the officers who serve under him. Sometimes he gives them praise. And when things really go wrong, they're the ones who get blamed, by the way. But but Caesar generally writes very favorably about his men, and he even kind of gives these cameo roles in his work to ordinary centurions, for example, and he immortalizes their names. So you see something about kind of Caesar, the general who has this bond with his troops, but also the politician, right, who really forms a
Yeah.
connection with the ordinary people. What he's less good at is getting along with his own peers. And this is really his whole political career, culminating in his assassination, right? As he doesn't get along with fellow senators, but he gets along better with soldiers, ordinary
Yeah.
Romans.
So let's talk about the Gallic War and, of course, the famous victory of the Western Generics and that little tiny village that still would resist Rome in 50 BC. I'm kidding, but let's talk about the famous Gallic War in that, of course, would gain Caesar the fame that, and eventually the dictatorship that would lead to the fall of the Republic.
Yeah, so Caesar ends up spending about 10 years in Gaul. And this initial migration of the Helvetian people, they're sent back, by the way, after they are defeated. But Caesar at this point is sort of sucked into the politics of Gaul. And it's an area where, the different communities fight against each other traditionally, and sometimes they form alliances, but then they don't want
Hmm.
one community to become too powerful. So there's sort of this whole world of politics there that he uncovers.
And
And
I'm sorry for interrupting you for a moment, but one thing that I want to discuss as well is a description of Gaul, because in the Gallic War, one of the most famous openings of the opening lines in the book is Gaul is divided in three parts. So let's discuss a little bit the geography of Gaul. And I'm sorry for interrupting you again, but I want to talk about of course, the most famous opening line of the Gallic Wars, and of course the part where Gaul is divided in three parts as well, and how accurate in or inaccurate. We discussed it in the part in my episode on Gaul a many years ago as well, where it's not really divided in three parts as Caesar claims.
yes, yeah, Caesar likes to simplify. And of course, that's appealing in some ways.
Mm,
It makes it easier to understand. He often has an agenda too with his geography. I mean, it's really Caesar who sort of comes up with the idea that we're going to call everyone beyond the Rhine Germans, and then people west of the Rhine, we will call them Gauls, right? So by Gaul in the broadest sense means, north of the Alps to the Rhine, to the Atlantic Ocean, to the Pyrenees. So France, but also Belgium, bits of Germany today. So it's a huge territory. And he sort of thinks there's the Celtic part of Gaul, then there's Aquitania, right? And then a very important, the third part is the Belgae, you know, which gives
yeah,
us the modern name Belgium, obviously. And those people he writes about as sort of being the least civilized. They're kind of the most like the Germans. For example, they don't yet drink wine the way that the Gauls do. Um, Italy had been making a lot of money actually importing their wine to Gaul for a while. The French wine industry was not in place yet. So um, Caesar, pretty early on, he has these victories over the Helvetii, then over the Germans, and then he decides to go up to fight the Belgae, so in the far north. This is very flat territory. So in some ways, it's easy, we know this from later history, right, to launch these invasions there. But Caesar ends up actually having a tough time with the Belgae, but he prevails. At this point, he has so destabilized Gaul, not just politically, but he has a large army. They're running around demanding food, right? People have been enslaved, so Gallic society starts to go through a crisis because of the arrival of the Romans. So it becomes like from their point of view, sort of a doom loop. We need food. We want to fight for our rights. We're trying to recover our people taken. We're going to fight harder. Then Caesar can say these people are so rebellious. they're so difficult. I
Mm,
have to fight them even harder. And it just snowballs into this huge war. And the Gauls do the unthinkable. They actually unite. Almost all of them unite with each other to fight the Romans. They want the
mm.
Romans out. And
Especially
this is,
that tiny little village that still resists in, of course, the very famously.
yeah, asterisk.
Yeah.
Uh, those are very clever books. And the authors, especially like the first one, they joke a lot about Caesar and are
Mm.
playing on Caesar's writings. So
The
it's
famous
fun to
Veni
go.
Vidi Vici George is maybe one of my favorites, one in the comic series.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely worth looking at, everybody.
Mm.
They are quite clever. I mean, they're just entertaining, but if you've read your Caesar too, there are even more jokes. And I think,
Yeah.
back in the day, French children probably had to suffer through, lessons about Caesar and the
Mm.
conquest of Gaul. And, so this would be perfect kind of comic book for children.
Mm. Now,
But the
to be
French,
quite,
just to say quickly, I mean, the
yeah,
French have kind of an interesting relationship. We talked about Napoleon, right?
yeah.
And the French in some ways are the heirs of the Romans. They speak the Roman language, but then they're also at moments they want to be the heirs of the Gauls, right?
Mm.
So they have this double heritage that
Yeah.
they can draw on.
Now, what I should perhaps mention is that the Gallic War was illegal by the Roman Senate, and what made it illegal, and how was there danger for Caesar to come back to Rome eventually if he had a victory? And because it was quite brutal if, for example, you would use spikes in the grass, for example, to, when when the Gauls would, run, and of course they would be stuck with this kind of fishing rods stuck in the grass, and of course the famous wall that he built to starve them out by the end of the war. But let's talk about how this war is also very illegal, even for a Roman perspective. I mean, today we have the Geneva Convention that defines the illegal wars. There were no such thing, of course, but they still had a sense of what was legal war and illegal war. So let's talk about that aspect of the war as well for a little while.
Yes. Well, I think the key point is it was kind of a debate at the time, and it came to be the major debate almost in Roman politics. Was what Caesar was doing legal? Or, as his critics said, was the whole thing illegal?
There was
Because
definitely war crimes committed back in the.
right. And so his worst enemy was a guy named Cato, Cato the Younger, a descendant of Cato the Elder.
Hmm. We talked about it
And
last week.
yeah, and he really wanted uh, Caesar to be punished for massacring ambassadors. This is kind of an interesting detail. Ambassadors in the ancient world were supposed to be protected no matter what, who didn't matter who sent them when or where, right? This was a convention accepted by everybody. And Caesar claims that some of these ambassadors, right, of the German people were trying to double cross him, and he ended up capturing and killing them. So Cato said he should be turned over to the enemy, right, which was the traditional punishment for this crime. Nobody else really had an appetite for that. But Cato and his friends were saying, the whole war was illegal, not just because of that, but because Caesar got the command illegally. He used violence in Rome when he was consul. He had charges still to answer for. So at the same time, Caesar's racking up these victories. He invaded Britain. This is like the moon landing almost
Yeah.
of Republican Rome. No Roman army had been there. Caesar plans,
It was
two
definitely
major.
fake. The British landing was definitely faked by the
Yeah,
government.
yeah, that's probably what Caesar's enemies would say. Yeah. He just wrote about it, and um, but I mean, I think it's actually the most exciting part in some
Yeah,
ways of his book. You can really see kind of his excitement as well as his soldiers' fear. And we can think about this because of D-Day,
yeah,
right? In reverse, but we know what a huge operation it is. Okay, the technology's changed, but just what a huge operation it is to land your army across the English Channel in territory unfriendly to you.
100%.
Yeah. So so this is glorious. The guy I mean, he claims he's sort of conquered Britain. He hasn't, but he's gone there, right? And he's bringing back spoils. He's building in Rome new amenities for the people using the loot from Gaul. So some people love Caesar, but the Senate, some of them anyway, are starting to grow very worried.
Mm.
And
What
and
is
Cato's
interesting,
complaints seem more and more prophetic. Like, yeah, this guy is becoming more powerful even than the whole republic, and that's dangerous. So
but I
it
want to, yeah, sorry for interrupting you again, but I want to emphasize one thing and if you look at history, what one of the stoppers why Caesar did not conquer Britain would be the weather and the misty weather that was when he went there. So what's interesting again and again and again throughout history, we see how important part the weather will play as a life game changer for historic battles. For example, the Battle of Vienna by Solomon the Magnificent. But and again, I'm doing a lot of comparisons here. But that's one of the reasons he did not win was because he had to leave some cannons behind because of the weather was so rainy that the roads were so muddy that the cannons would not go all the way to Vienna. And we see this in those series are in Britain as well on the cliff of Dover when it came that the weather was also one of the biggest obstacles for him to actually conquer Britain.
Yeah, such a good point. I mean, the crossing the ocean, right? He times it
Yeah.
carefully. So when there's a full moon, right? So he has enough light, he can do it at night. But he doesn't seem to entirely understand the tides, right? So some of his fleet gets wiped out, actually more than once. And that's very scary. I mean, this is what I mean about the suspense of this part of the book. It's very scary because he could be
Mm.
stranded there. He might not have supplies. His cavalry never made it over,
Yeah.
which was a huge problem because the British fight, in a more guerrilla style. They have chariots. So he's often kind of in trouble. And what's interesting is to see how he managed to at least extricate himself from these situations. He's
Mm.
very good at that. He works himself into dangerous positions, but then he always manages to escape until the very end.
Also, what another fun fact is that in over 2,000 years, the British weather hasn't changed at all since the time of Caesar. So that's also another fun fact about the weather in the UK.
I have to admit, a few years ago, I was on sabbatical in the UK, and I arrived in September. It was very nice, pretty long days,
Hmm.
but I'd heard all these warnings, watch out for the winter. And by December, I really thought I was living on the North Pole. I mean, it was so dark and wet cold, that kind of cold that seeps into your
Yeah.
bones. And having lived in Rome too as a student, these are not the same climates.
I mean, I'm
The
from
Romans
Norway, so when I
really
lived there, that
struggled
was
in
like
Britain.
summer for me. So, yes, we had a different experience of the British winter.
Yeah, it's a place where an Italian would
Yeah, not be happy.
struggle. Yeah. Yeah.
Now we perhaps. just to the, I mean, every part of what we discussed has been exciting so far, but perhaps one of the most exciting parts of the fall of the Roman Republic is the civil war that would go on after Caesar's attempted conquest of of Britain, and of course his return home to the Roman Republic. And one of the key players here is, of course, Pompey. We haven't talked too much about him, and of course, I will talk more about him in detail later. But there's just been so much that we talked about that I see we are soon running out of time. So let's spend the last 20 minutes that we have, perhaps, to discuss the Civil War. And of course, Caesar wrote a diary about the, or his own
Mhm.
biography of that as well. And I haven't read it yet, but it's on my list. But of course, let's still talk about the famous civil war that would take place on Caesar's return. And and this is where we come back to, the part where we discuss the legal and illegal aspect of the conquest of Gaul, because Caesar has delivered them a empire now. So the Rome is now what we in modern terms would call an empire, and on top of that has probably one of the most slaves in history of the Roman Republic as well, because and the riches that they would bring from the conquest. So, but there were also legal justifications that he had to defend himself for, and that was a big problem on returning to Rome. So let's talk about the more moral conflict of the conquest, and of course, how would he return without being persecuted by the Roman Senate?
Yes, so civil war breaks out again, and militarily it's epic because we have the two great generals of the
Mm.
day, Julius Caesar
Perhaps
and
the
Pompey.
most epic civil war in the entire Roman history. I mean, of course, Augustus' civil war is great as well, but this kind of, I would say this is the bow Augustus, and another key player that we haven't talked about yet as well, and I'm sorry for derailing a little bit, but we have to talk about Mark Antony as well, of course, because this is where he become important. I almost can't believe I almost forgotten about him. And of course, but he is also a key player in this Civil War as well as the next one that would be under Augustus as well.
Yes, so militarily, the war is fascinating. As we're saying, Pompey has this strategy. He's basically become friends with the Stop Caesar crowd in Rome. But militarily, they kind of decide on a strategy where they're going to evacuate Italy right at the start of the war. They abandon the city of Rome. They even abandon Italy. The fear is Caesar had that army in Gaul, and they've been fighting with Caesar. They were battle tested. Pompey is smart enough to know you don't want to mess with that, especially with raw recruits.
And I know,
So,
I know we've forgotten to mention just really briefly, and I'm going to stop talking soon, but that earlier, Pompey would marry Caesar's daughter, and they would have a decent relationship for a while. But when she died, I think she was in childbirth. The relationship would be estranged, and they will go more and more towards enemies. And I know there's a lot we haven't mentioned or don't have time to talk about, but I just want to mention briefly that little episode. I know we haven't mentioned it, but I think it's important just to mention a little bit at least.
oh yes, yeah, this is part of the drama, right? Is Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, they were getting along for a while, and Caesar, to ensure Pompey's cooperation, he married his only daughter, Julia. His only child was married to Pompey. But as you say, she died in childbirth, and Pompey was very grief-stricken. Uh, but he ended up marrying another woman who was more, her family was more on the other side. So you have kind of, yeah, this very human drama playing out. Crassus was defeated in fighting the Parthians, as we discussed earlier. So the gang breaks down, and Pompey, as we're saying, right, he's afraid, he's worried about taking on Caesar militarily. The other thing, though, to say, right, is I mean, the Romans have lived through one civil war. Pompey, Caesar, they all lived through that first one. And nobody kind of wants to do it again if they don't have to. You don't want to be accused of being the new
Yeah.
Sulla. So, so they kind of come up with strategies too to try to minimize, if possible, loss of citizens' lives. So Pompey wants to evacuate, maybe try to strangle the food supply of Italy, using naval blockade to force Caesar to surrender. Caesar's strategy is to go on the offensive. So he sweeps down Italy very fast, and then he goes to Spain. Pompey controls Spain. But Caesar's other interesting strategy is clemency. He says, if you come over to my side, I forgive you completely,
Mm.
whether you're an ordinary soldier of Pompey or one of his leading officers. And this actually works out pretty well for Caesar, but it's designed to sort of, he's hoping he can avoid being blamed for starting the war by this strategy.
Mm.
So
That's double
civil war has an
standard.
interesting politics, because it's not just like fighting an enemy whom you don't have to live with afterwards.
Mm.
Romans kind of know that the war and politics blend together in a struggle like this. So yeah, you mentioned Antony. He was an officer of Caesar in Gaul and then joined him in the Civil War. And Caesar has sort of a fondness for these very young, aggressive officers. So Antony is one of them. And Antony does good service
He's a
for
very
Caesar
cocky man, Anthony.
completely. He loves the ladies, right? I mean, he is kind of a man after Caesar's own heart. Caesar is also, a reputation as Rome's
Yeah.
greatest ladies' man, and
He's
later
what we
things
would call a
have put
frat boy in the 21st century, I think.
completely. Yeah, and Antony is actually um so he's a good officer. He also is actually, in my opinion, a good public speaker too. This is one thing, obviously, if you've ever read Shakespeare's famous play, Julius Caesar, the heart of that play is the funeral oration that
Mm.
Antony gives. So he can really rile up a crowd too. So he has talents that Caesar likes. And one point I would just make, right, is so the Civil War broke out in 49. In a way, it kind of goes on for 20 years. Caesar's assassinated. Pompey dies in very shocking circumstances that we'll
In
discuss.
Egypt,
In Egypt, yes. But Cleopatra, Antony, for example, they both lived through the whole war.
yeah.
After Caesar died, his soldiers, his friends, they're very angry and they want to kind of revive the cause. And then enemies of Caesar also form up into legions. So you
Mm.
kind of have 20 years, I think, is a useful way to think about this. And it's kind of easy to remember. It's the 40s and the 30s BC. And it really is just as dramatic, I think, as the 1930s
Yeah.
and 1940s AD. I mean, this is just a titanic struggle and will decide the fate of the Roman Empire.
Mm. Now,
So we should,
I know we don't have skimmed a bit through the Civil War, and I intend to apologize. We simply don't have time to go so much in detail. So do forgive us for not talking too much. It's an episode in itself, and I do plan to cover it closer in the future. But I want to talk a little bit about how Caesar won the Civil War and his return to Rome and his final years as a ruler, and finally the final death of Caesar and the end of the Roman. No, it's not completely end by Caesar's death, but I want to end it here with the death of Caesar, because that also kind of symbolizes, I think, the end of the Roman Republic as well.
yeah. So Pompey's strategy of attrition does work for a while, but his allies really want to fight a big battle. That's the Roman way. So
Mm.
they kind of force Pompey finally to fight Caesar at the um, Battle of
Actium?
Pharsalus.
Yeah, yeah.
This is Pharsalus, yeah, and Caesar has a huge victory. Pompey goes running to Egypt, and he thinks that the king there owes him favors. So Pompey's hoping Egypt is very wealthy. He's hoping to get money, grain, continue the war. He will use Egypt as his power base now. The Egyptians don't want that. And there's a teenager on the throne, okay, King Ptolemy the
Mm.
13th.
Whose
He and
famous brother is Cleopatra, of course, the seventh,
yes,
might I add.
so he and his advisors decide treacherously to kill Pompey as he's being brought to shore. And they lop his head off and throw the body away on the beach. I mean, it's just, again, one of these epic moments. This
Mm.
was the most powerful man for
It's a
decades.
tragic death for such a man with, such a rich history and a rich life. It's a tragic death.
Completely, completely. It's really amazing moment. So the head of Pompey gets sent to Caesar, who's in pursuit in Alexandria. There's a civil war in Egypt going on, and Caesar takes the side of the older sister of King Ptolemy the 13th. This is the famous Cleopatra.
I mean, I can't blame her. I can't blame him, really. I mean, I would have done the same too, to be fair.
Oh, and she was very shrewd. This is one power available to
Mm.
her as a woman, in a man's world. So she picks the right lovers. Later, she takes up with Antony. So anyway, this war, it's a great romance. It's a wonderful story, but it actually is a problem because Caesar gets stuck in Egypt way too long. And his allies
Yeah.
are able to regroup in Africa, North
Mm.
Africa, and Tunisia. So he ends up having to take a large expedition to Africa and does succeed, right? But it prolongs the civil war and more
Yeah.
casualties. But he wins and he goes back to Rome and he
Mm.
celebrates this huge series of triumphs. He's going to have four triumphs: Egypt, Africa, but also he's celebrating his victories in Gaul.
Now, I want to go back a little bit, if you don't mind, because while Caesar is in Egypt, and of course there are some things that were kind of left out a little bit. That of course, when Pompey left Rome, his hope would be that Caesar would go into Rome and occupy Rome when there was no senators, no rulers there. But Caesar doesn't take the bait, so instead he does leave Antony in his stead to rule Rome, and while he go on to chase Pompey. And one thing to be said about Pompey, sorry, not Pompey, but Antony, is that he is many things, but the leader is not one of them. So just briefly before we go into Caesar's return, I want to talk a little bit about the leadership of Antony during Caesar's absence as well.
Yes. Well, we have to keep in mind Antony went on to fight Caesar's heir,
Mm,
the Emperor Augustus.
yeah,
And of course, then we talked earlier about stories, propaganda. The propaganda machine had to kick in. So everything good that Antony ever did had to be swept under the rug, and and he gets turned into uh
this playboy
maybe
been,
not a
yeah.
monster, but yeah, it's more like a playboy, somebody in over his head, right? And I think this is misleading. I think he actually was quite effective for a long period
The
and
propaganda worked
very
quite well
dangerous.
2,000 years later.
Yeah. Yeah, so he did have to manage Rome in Caesar's absence and he struggled. But the truth is it was a very hard job for anyone. There are food shortages during the Civil War, people's are losing family members, and then there are restless elements in the population. So Antony struggles, but he does an okay job. Finally, Caesar returns and is sort of able to take over things. Antony, by the way, is given the job of liquidating Pompey's estates to raise money. Again, a very hateful task, but he actually gets it done. So he is an effective administrator and leader at times. Uh, but as I said, Caesar comes back after the victory in Africa, huge triumphs. His idea is I'm going to throw a big party. Let's all forget about the civil wars.
Yeah.
Only problem is Pompey's sons are still alive, and they are mounting a resistance in Spain. So Caesar can say war is over, but it's not over.
Is this where sent Agrippa into Spain at this point?
Yeah. Caesar is forced, right, to take an army to Spain. And this is actually one of the most vicious battles he ever has to fight in Spain and dangerous to him, but he prevails. One of Pompey's sons, though, is left alive, and he will continue to stay there and keep fighting even after Caesar died.
Hmm.
So this is what I mean about it's sort of a continuous struggle.
Yeah.
And people called Caesar and people called Pompey, they keep fighting each other, even when the original ones
Hmm.
die. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
No, no, that's
So
sorry.
we
Yeah,
should
go
get
on.
to Caesar's, fate after
Hmm.
this war in Spain, right? He comes back to
Yeah.
Rome and doesn't have a whole lot longer to live.
So let's
Uh,
talk about his time in us, how we become dictators. And one of the things we discussed earlier, perhaps has not mentioned yet, but the one of the things that kings of the old days in Rome were known for were wearing purple as a sign of royalty, which was very much common in this day. And I just want to add a little fun fact is that Lex Luthor in Smallville wears a lot of purple shirts, and that's kind of a resonance to the Roman emperors who wear purple. Just a little fun fact there. But anyway, not to derail too much. Well, let's talk a little bit about Caesar and when he start how there's the famous don't know how much legend this is. Perhaps you can verify, but the story goes from what I know is that he starts wearing purple in more and more in the Senate, and when he becomes dictator, he has these great plans for Rome, and it's one of the big red flags for the Roman Senate that he is. The worry is that he will become a crown himself a king again, and Rome would be under a monarchy, which ironically there would be anyway, in all but name a few months later. But let's talk about the process of Caesar's downfall and how he would fall on in the end across the fall of the Roman Republic. And again, I know that it doesn't really end before the civil war with Augustus ends, but we simply don't have time to cover that today, unfortunately. So we don't have to end with the death of Caesar. So let's talk about what would lead to the end of Caesar eventually.
yeah, so Caesar was smart enough to know never to call himself king. That is a rule
Yeah.
in Roman politics that always holds, no matter what else. But his enemies say this is a monarchy in all but name, and he does love the trappings of power. As you say, he dresses more like a king, and he starts to wear a laurel wreath on his head all the time that looks sort of like a crown. But most importantly, he was calling all the shots militarily,
And again to
politically,
throw
financially.
the and then again to the other throwback to Asterix comics, this is what we see Caesar as wearing all the time. Where the and there's also I don't know if you've seen the movies, but in the movies at least, the Brutus I think is always trying to assassinate Caesar in the hilarious ways. It's a long time since I've seen it, but that's one of the things I remember about about the movies is that Brutus always tries to assassinate Caesar whenever he can. I'm sorry, I know I'm derailing a little bit, but I
No, 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 no.
just had to
Yeah,
bring it up.
yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of.
It's iconic.
I mean, it's you can turn it into a great tragedy,
Yeah.
like Shakespeare did, but the Brutus's dilemma over what to do. But yeah, you can also sort of see dark humor in this period,
Mm.
and this is the Roman way. So we are told, right, that Caesar loved that honor of the crown because he
Yeah,
was going bald and he was a very vain man. So this was a way to mask his baldness. So,
yeah.
but I think in all seriousness, what happened was Brutus, Cassius, especially the younger men. It's not so much people Caesar's age, but a slightly younger generation. They realize, they can still have political careers. Caesar treated Brutus very well. He forgave him, he advanced him, but
That
they
was
know
not the first time
everything.
he betrayed him by the when he stabbed him stabbed him. That was not would not be the first time he betrayed Caesar.
Yeah. They they know that everything they're getting is only because Caesar wants it. And they just can't live with that. That to them is tyranny.
Yeah,
And it's the very antithesis of the Republic. So they start spreading stories. We've talked about that. Caesar's behavior probably gets exaggerated, but they have to figure out a way to kill him. He's about to go off to the east. Caesar thought the solution really to ending civil wars was to go fight a huge war in the Middle East. I'm going to go to Parthia, fight the Parthians.
yeah,
I'll be the new Alexander the Great. Everybody will forget about the civil war. So time is short. So they come up with this idea that they would kill him at a meeting of the Senate when he wouldn't be that well protected and would be
yeah.
vulnerable. And they can smuggle in their daggers. That's what they do. This is pretty well planned.
Now,
The actual killing, and they surround him.
if I
And
may, again, sorry for interrupting you, but from what my understanding, the conspirators are 60 people that conspire to kill Caesar, and that's quite a lot of people. So how do you keep everyone from being quiet like that? And the story goes like again, the story with emphasis on the story here. So how do you keep people from being quiet when there's so many people involved? I mean, even 20 or less, if it was less than more than 10 people, how do you keep one from snitching on that? Hey, Caesar, somebody that can murder you. And you have the famous story where his wife at the time or love mistress have a dream that Caesar is murdered, and you have the famous "Beware the Ides of March" line. And so how did the conspirators keep this quiet? And also, and I'm sorry for speaking so long time this episode, but there is also the at the time I think she's a fair assassination, so he was switching forums almost every day, every week to have a different place to hold the Senate. And so how do you keep so much like this quiet? And what are the conspiracies versus the real history here?
yes, it does become uh, enshrouded with legend, right? And
Yeah.
did Caesar's wife have a bad dream that he was going to be killed, or is that just a story told later? I think what we can say is the conspiracy came together pretty quickly, and probably the number of people in the Senate who killed him was not 60. It was
Obviously.
maybe more like a dozen or 15. And I think because it came together quickly, they managed to preserve secrecy. At the same time, it does seem clear that Caesar's friends thought he wasn't taking his security seriously enough.
Mm.
And, one way to think about this is maybe it's Caesar's arrogance, right? He
Yeah.
sort of thinks, well, I've made it through so much before, I'll be fine.
Yeah.
It may be his pride too. I don't want to walk around, surrounded by large security forces. That will make me look bad, right? But for whatever reason, he doesn't want to take all the steps necessary to secure himself.
So what really happened in the Ides of March? And let's talk a little bit about the but I'm gonna call it fan fiction in some ways because in a lot of ways there is also a lot of mythology in on the Ides of March and the famous death of Caesar as well. So let's talk a little bit about that part as well.
Yeah, so Caesar came to the Senate, and the plan was one of the conspirators brought a letter to him and was asking for Caesar to consider something. And then this was the signal for the others in the plot. They circled around him, pulled out the daggers they had hidden under their togas, and they hacked at him, and he fell. He died. I think the assassins, maybe hoped this was in the Senate. Everybody would say at once, "Oh, you've given us back our liberty." But actually, the rest of the senators ran away in terror. Everybody was afraid it might next, and the people of
Yeah,
Rome become terrified. So the city sort of becomes completely panicked, and the shops shut down. It's like a ghost town almost. The assassins end up running to the Capitol Hill, to the old temple of Jupiter, and they sort of hide out there and have to figure out their next moves. Now, it's kind of easy in hindsight to say they weren't very well organized, but this gets to your point about secrecy, right? You can't plan
yeah.
very much, otherwise word is going to get out. So they sort of have to try to improvise, right? The other problem they face is, they don't want a military dictatorship. That's the very thing they're fighting against. They want to go through the Senate. They want to get popular support. So there's this kind of period, right, where the Senate starts to meet, as is typical in the Republic. They figure out, what are we going to do, right? And this is where Antony appears on the scene again, because he is the consul. So he's in a very powerful position. And he agrees, along with the assassins, that they're going to have a sort of amnesty. And nobody will be punished for killing Caesar. At the same time, what Caesar did, especially administratively, his appointments, those would be honored so that there wouldn't be total chaos. The other thing Antony gets is the public funeral for Caesar. And this is when he gives the speech that helps to incite the crowd, right? And they go on a rampage. They've learned through Caesar's will that they've been given money. He's left a bequest to all the citizens of Rome. So even though Caesar become a little unpopular in some ways, after his death, there's this sudden kind of mourning and nostalgia. And Antony plays on that. But even more, what happens is Caesar, in his will, has adopted his 18-year-old nephew, Gaius Octavius, and he's studying abroad, but he comes back to Italy once he learns of Caesar's death, and he really starts crying for revenge. And Caesar has veterans settled in colonies throughout Italy. He has powerful friends. They all start to join forces and basically illegally raise an army. And the mission is to avenge the death of Caesar.
What happened to Brutus right after the execution? Sorry, the murder by Caesar.
Yeah. So Brutus, Cassius, the others, right? They benefit from this amnesty. So they're not supposed to be punished.
Yeah.
They still hold political office. Actually, Brutus was holding the office of praetor, below consul, in the year 44. But their position in Rome becomes unsustainable. They're huge mobs, they're veterans of Caesar, right? Brutus really can't walk around safely after a period. So he goes to southern Italy, Cassius does, and it's a little hard to trace, but it seems as if basically they start to revive the Pompeian strategy. that
Yeah.
we will raise armies in the east. Sextus Pompey, the son of Pompey, is in Spain. So we will abandon Italy and try to encircle the Caesarians, right? So it's almost a repeat of the year 49 BC. And Cassius, the ally of Brutus, his brother-in-law, he was a very good general too. And he seems to be very important in devising this strategy.
Mm. So there's a lot of mythology surrounding Caesar's death. For example, the beware of out March, the dream of his mistress at the time, and obviously everyone warning him about the conspiracy taking place, and Ode to Brute, if by Shakespeare. Do you have a favorite mythology out of all of these that's surrounding that may not necessarily be true, but they're fun nonetheless? That's it.
Yeah, um, very good question. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure I have a favorite single line, but I will. I've already mentioned it before. I really do love Shakespeare's play,
Yeah,
Julius Caesar, because what I love about it is that Shakespeare obviously was a playwright. He was a man of the theater. And I think when he read the story of Julius Caesar, of Brutus, of Antony, he intuitively understood just how theatrical Roman politics was. And he, brought it to life on the
yeah,
stage because it really already was a sort of staged event, something you performed before an audience of, in Rome's case, of thousands. So I love that speech he gives in Shakespeare Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. And he uses irony very, very effectively. So that's probably my favorite um, kind of mythologized version of this period of Roman history.
yeah. What would you say is the legacy of the Roman Republic, and how do you think it's remembered in the 21st century by it's most of the myths surrounding the Republic, such as the Spartacus War, the Punic War, and Hannibal and Caesar and Pompey and all this. I mean, there's a lot of events surrounding the Roman Republic, but what would you say is the legacy, and how do you think we remember the Roman Republic today? The corruption, not just all the everything else I mentioned, for example. What do you find? I mean, obviously, one legacy is the Roman Empire, but that's the obvious answer. But in your mind, is there anything else that you might think about?
Yes, well, I think as we were discussing, the Romans are very sharp-tongued. They like to attack each other, and they, are always saying society is collapsing, right? And now
Yeah,
eventually the Roman Republic did collapse, but they left us a very colorful and satirical literature, right? So I think because of their own writings, you know, we remember the glory of Rome and their great success militarily. We talk about that, but even more, as you say, we sort of talk about corruption and the fall of Rome and when people are lamenting something in politics, they say this is like the fall of the Roman Republic or the fall of Rome.
yeah.
So I think it gets remembered, right, for things that went wrong, but we should also remember just how many things that the Romans did right. In particular, if you live in a
100%.
modern democracy, right, and want to preserve democracy, the Roman
And how far
Republic,
that
far
goes,
from
we'll see.
perfect, though far from perfect, I mean, it did pioneer some ideas that became very important in the modern period
Yeah,
about rule of law and election of magistrates, checks and balances, all these sorts of things, right? That were very influential, especially in the 18th century. as people are trying to devise modern states that don't depend on kings, on monarchs. So I hope we would, remember that about Rome and learn that from Rome as well.
Now, thank you so much for coming, and I think we just round it up there. It's been a great pleasure to have you. I hope you enjoyed this three-part series on the Roman Republic. There are, of course, a lot of stuff we did not have time to mention in these three parts that we will, of course, rediscover that are worth an entire podcast in itself. And it's been it's been a great pleasure to have you here. You're always welcome back, of course. Before you go, do you have if anyone's still listening, do you have anything you want to share, promote, or anything? If people have questions about the Roman Republic, or especially that is your, you process of what the episode what we talked about today. So is there anyone that have any questions about the current time that we period that we talked about? Where can people find you? And do you have anything else you want to share on the books? You mentioned your book about Cicero last episode. Where can people find that book? And of course, anything else you want to share now is the time.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. It's been great fun to talk about the Roman Republic with you. People can find me on the website of the university where I teach, Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and you'll find some information there about my books. I'll just mention the latest book I wrote, Lawless Republic: The Rise of Cicero and the Decline of Rome, which is about the period we were talking about today, and especially the criminal courts. And you'll see how Cicero mastered, uh, became the master of the courts, but also how he was led into problems and problems that contributed to some of Rome's larger crisis.
Thank you again so much for coming for again. It's been a great pleasure as always. This has been with that aged well. We are available on social media on Twitter and Instagram. And over that aged well, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find all podcasts. It says all three parts are now available, so you can listen back to back if you wish to. I would have that's perhaps the best way to learn about the Roman Republic on this podcast. If you're on Spotify, leave a comment on Spotify and rate us 5 stars. That would be nice. At least in Europe so far, we have a free country, and if you are on Apple Podcasts, leave a review, 5 stars as well. And if you're on YouTube, like, share, comment, and subscribe. This has been Alan. The next week we'll take our minds to Al Andalus and Islamic Spain. So stay tuned for that week. Next week. This has been With That Aged Well. My name's Alan, and I'll see you next time.